When I first took the night shift as a subway security officer, I didn't think much of it. The pay was decent, the hours were predictable, and I figured the job would be mostly uneventful. My supervisor, Dennis, joked during orientation that the most dangerous thing I'd encounter would be a rat trying to outrun a train. He gave me a half smile and said it was the easiest money I'd ever make. As long as you don't overthink things, the first few weeks were calm. I spent my nights patrolling the platform, checking for stragglers, and listening to the distant hum of trains as they rolled in and out of the station. Most passengers during my shift were harmless. Exhausted workers heading home, the occasional tipsy group laughing too loudly, and the quiet loners who avoided eye contact. The station itself, Hollow Point Terminal, was old but functional. It had a reputation for being a transit hub more than a destination, with its stained tiles, flickering overhead lights, and the faint smell of mildew that no amount of cleaning could erase. My job was to lock up after the last train and ensure no one lingered. Dennis had warned me about the occasional trespasser trying to camp overnight, but I hadn't encountered any, at least not in the beginning. One Thursday night, near the end of my shift, something unusual happened. The 1:37 a.m. train, the last one of the night, had already come and gone. I was making my final sweep of the station when I noticed a man sitting on the far end of the platform. He wore a dark hoodie and jeans, his face hidden in the shadows cast by the dim light. I called out to him from a distance, letting him know the station was closing. He didn't respond. Instead, he sat perfectly still, his head tilted slightly as if listening for something. I hesitated for a moment before walking closer, repeating my announcement. The closer I got, the more unsettled I felt. His stillness was unnerving, like he wasn't just ignoring me but actively pretending I wasn't there. When I was about 10 feet away, he finally stood up. Without a word, he turned and walked toward the emergency exit at the far end of the platform. I called after him, reminding him that the exit was alarmed and asking him to leave through the main stairs instead. He didn't even glance back. I stood there for a moment, debating whether to follow him. My job wasn't to chase people into the tunnels, and Dennis had been clear about avoiding unnecessary risks. But something about the man's behavior didn't sit right with me. Against my better judgment, I decided to check the exit door to make sure he hadn't triggered the alarm. When I reached the door, it was closed and locked as it should have been. No alarm had sounded. That would have been the end of it. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something strange on the floor. A small piece of paper lay there, folded neatly into a square. I picked it up, curiosity overriding my caution. Inside, written in shaky handwriting, were 3 words: "Don't trust anyone." The note stuck with me all night, even after I locked up and headed home. I told myself it was probably a prank or some cryptic nonsense left by a commuter. But the man's strange behavior and the way he disappeared so silently gnawed at me. Over the next few nights, I started paying closer attention to the platform, especially during the last train. The same passengers appeared regularly, familiar faces on predictable schedules. But every so often, I'd notice someone unfamiliar, standing too close to the edge or lingering longer than necessary. One night, about a week after finding the note, I saw her, a young woman in a business suit, sitting alone on a bench. Her head was bowed, and her hands were clasped tightly around her purse. She was the only passenger waiting for the last train. When it arrived, she didn't get on. Instead, she remained seated, her knuckles whitening as she gripped her bag. The train doors closed, and it rumbled away, leaving her alone on the platform. I approached cautiously, asking if she was okay. She looked up at me, and her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She said something about forgetting her wallet and needing to go back upstairs. I offered to walk her to the exit, but she shook her head and hurried away, her heels clicking loudly against the tiles. I watched her leave, uneasy about her sudden panic. When I turned back toward the bench, I saw another folded piece of paper sitting there. This one read, "They're watching you." By this point, I was certain someone was messing with me. Maybe it was a group of pranksters targeting night shift workers, or maybe it was Dennis testing how I'd handle stress. But there was no way I could prove it. The station's security cameras had been unreliable for years, often cutting out or freezing during crucial moments. I tried to bring it up with Dennis the next day, but he brushed it off, laughing as he told me to stop overthinking things. He said night shifts played tricks on the mind, especially in an empty station. But the notes kept coming. Each one was left in a place I couldn't miss. The bench, the ticket booth, even inside the supply closet where I stored my gear. They always had the same ominous tone. Warnings about people I couldn't trust or vague hints about being watched. I started to notice more strange behavior from passengers, too. People would stare at me for just a little too long or whisper to each other while glancing in my direction. The breaking point came 2 weeks later. It was another quiet night, and I was sitting in the control room, reviewing my log for the shift. The sound of footsteps caught my attention. I checked the monitors, but as usual, the cameras were frozen on grainy still frames from hours earlier. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the corridor, listening carefully. The footsteps grew louder, echoing down the tunnel where the trains ran. I called out, asking if someone was there. No response. Against every instinct telling me to stay put, I followed the sound. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing the damp, graffiti-covered walls of the tunnel. The footsteps stopped abruptly, leaving me in unsettling silence. That's when I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the beam of my flashlight. They were barely visible in the dim light, but I could make out the same dark hoodie I'd seen weeks ago. I shouted for them to stop and identify themselves. The figure didn't move. Instead, they raised an arm and pointed deeper into the tunnel, where the darkness was absolute. I didn't wait to find out what they wanted. I backed away slowly, keeping my flashlight trained on them until I was far enough to turn and run. When I reached the platform, I slammed the emergency button to alert the transit authority. They found no one in the tunnel. I used to think working in the subway was the perfect job for someone who preferred solitude. As a maintenance worker for the city's transit system, my shifts were mostly spent alone, deep in the tunnels, where the only sounds were the distant rumble of trains and the occasional drip of water from overhead pipes. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills and gave me a sense of purpose. That changed the night I heard the sound. It was supposed to be a routine shift, cleaning debris from the tracks and inspecting the wiring in a section of Tunnel 42B. The area was scheduled for maintenance between midnight and 4 a.m., which meant I'd have a few hours of uninterrupted time to get the job done. I had done it 100 times before. Walk the length of the tunnel, check for loose wiring or damaged pipes, clear out anything that didn't belong, and report back to the supervisor at the end of my shift. Tunnel 42B wasn't particularly special. It was one of the older sections of the network, built decades ago when the city expanded its transit system. The walls were cracked and stained, and the air always had a metallic tang that lingered in your nose. Still, it was stable enough, and nobody complained about it as long as the trains kept running. I arrived at the service entrance around 11:45 p.m. with my gear, flashlight, tool belt, and a small portable radio to stay in contact with the control room. After signing in, I descended the metal stairs into the tunnel. The station above was already closed for the night, so the world below felt completely cut off, insulated by layers of concrete and silence. The first hour went by uneventfully. I walked the length of the tunnel, my flashlight sweeping over the tracks and walls. Everything seemed in order, no major damage, no unexpected debris. I was about to move on to the wiring inspection when I heard it for the first time. A faint, high-pitched whistle. It wasn't the kind of whistle you'd hear from a train. This was sharper, more deliberate, like the sound someone might make to get your attention. I stopped in my tracks, turning my flashlight toward the source of the noise. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty tunnel ahead. I radioed the control room, asking if anyone else was scheduled to be in 42B that night. The operator responded almost immediately, confirming that I was the only worker assigned to that section. I thanked him and didn't press further. It wasn't the first time I'd heard strange noises in the tunnels. Sound carried in odd ways underground, bouncing off walls and twisting into unrecognizable echoes. I convinced myself it was nothing and continued working. But the whistle came again. This time it was louder, closer. It seemed to come from somewhere just ahead of me, around the bend in the tunnel. I hesitated, shining my flashlight in that direction. The beam landed on a pile of debris, loose gravel and scraps of metal that had likely fallen from the ceiling over time. Nothing unusual, but the sound was unmistakable now, clear and deliberate. "Hello!" I called out, my voice echoing. No response. I stood there for a moment, debating whether to investigate further. Protocol dictated that I report any suspicious activity immediately, but something about the whistle felt off. It wasn't just the sound itself. It was the timing, the way it seemed to respond to my presence as if it were calling me forward. Against my better judgment, I started walking toward the bend. The air grew colder as I advanced, and the metallic tang in the air became more pronounced. My flashlight flickered briefly, and I smacked it against my palm to bring it back to life. The whistle sounded again, louder than before. It was almost playful now, like someone toying with me. When I rounded the bend, my flashlight revealed an old maintenance alcove built into the wall. A small, recessed space where workers could take shelter if a train came through. The alcove was empty except for an abandoned tool bag and a rusted metal ladder bolted to the wall. I called out again, my voice sharp with unease. "If someone's there, you're not supposed to be down here." Silence. I moved closer to the alcove, inspecting the tool bag. It was filthy, covered in dust and grime, but something about it looked familiar. I crouched down and unzipped it, revealing a collection of rusted tools that hadn't been used in years. And then I saw it. Etched into the concrete wall behind the bag were a series of scratches, long, jagged lines that crisscrossed each other like frantic scribbles. At first, I thought they were random, the result of years of wear and tear. But as I shone my flashlight over them, I realized they formed a pattern. Words. "Don't listen to it." A chill ran down my spine. I stood up quickly, scanning the tunnel around me. The whistle came again, this time from behind me. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping over the tracks. The tunnel was empty. I grabbed my radio and called the control room again, my voice trembling as I asked if they were absolutely certain no one else was in the area. The operator's response was calm, almost dismissive. "Nobody's scheduled to be there but you. Are you sure you're okay?" I didn't answer. I just stood there, gripping the radio tightly as I listened to the silence. That's when I heard the footsteps. They were faint at first, almost imperceptible, but they grew louder with each passing second. Someone or something was walking toward me from the other end of the tunnel. My flashlight caught nothing but empty tracks and damp walls. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps stopped abruptly, replaced by the whistle, shrill and mocking. It echoed off the walls, coming from every direction at once. I turned and ran. By the time I reached the service entrance, I was out of breath, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the lock. I burst through the door and slammed it shut behind me, the sound reverberating through the stairwell. I reported everything to my supervisor the next day. He listened patiently, nodding as I described the whistle, the scratches on the wall, and the abandoned tool bag. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and let out a long sigh. "You're not the first to mention it," he said quietly. I stared at him, unsure if I had heard correctly. He explained that Tunnel 42B had a reputation among workers. Over the years, multiple employees had reported hearing strange noises or seeing things that didn't make sense. The scratches on the wall? They'd been found and erased before, only to reappear later. "Some people think it's just the acoustics," he said. "Others, well, they don't like to talk about it." I asked why the tunnel hadn't been shut down if so many incidents had occurred. He shrugged and told me the same thing I'd heard 100 times before. The trains had to keep running. I transferred to a different section the following week. I never went back to 42B, and I never asked what became of it. I started taking the subway every day after my car broke down. At first, I hated it, the crowds, the delays, the stale air that hung heavy in the tunnels. But after a few weeks, I settled into a routine. I began to recognize the regulars. The man in the navy suit who always boarded at Sheridan, the teenager with headphones so loud you could hear the bass across the car, the elderly woman who clutched her handbag like it held her life savings. By the time the incident happened, the subway had become a kind of background noise in my life, predictable and unremarkable. But what I witnessed that night shattered any sense of normalcy I'd come to rely on. It started with a delay. I had been running late that evening, stuck at the office finishing up paperwork. By the time I reached the station, the 8:15 train had already come and gone. The next one wasn't due for another 20 minutes, so I settled onto a bench and pulled out my phone to pass the time. The platform was nearly deserted. A few stragglers waited farther down, an older man leaning on a cane, a young couple whispering to each other, and a security guard pacing near the edge of the platform. The hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional drip of water were the only sounds. When the train finally arrived, it screeched to a halt with a metallic groan that echoed through the tunnel. The doors slid open, and I stepped into the car, relieved to see it mostly empty. I took a seat near the middle, my back to the wall, and watched as the other passengers boarded. The older man with the cane sat across from me, his eyes fixed on the floor. The young couple took a seat near the far end, still whispering. The security guard didn't board, instead standing on the platform and watching as the doors closed. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, the guard's expression seemed off. The train lurched forward, picking up speed as it entered the tunnel. I stared out the window, my reflection faint against the dark backdrop of the underground. The ride was smooth at first, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels almost soothing. Then I noticed the man. He was sitting at the very front of the car, 2 rows ahead of me, in a seat I could have sworn had been empty when I boarded. He wore a dark coat and a hat pulled low over his face, obscuring his features. His posture was rigid, his hands resting on his knees as he stared straight ahead. At first, I thought I must have missed him in my initial scan of the car. Maybe he'd been there all along, and I just hadn't noticed. But something about him felt out of place. The older man across from me shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the figure at the front of the car. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then seemed to think better of it and returned his gaze to the floor. The train stopped at the next station, and the doors slid open with their usual hiss. Nobody boarded. The man at the front of the car stood up. His movements were slow and deliberate, almost mechanical. He walked toward the doors, but instead of stepping off, he stood there, facing the platform, as if waiting for someone. The doors stayed open longer than usual, the seconds stretching into an uncomfortable silence. I glanced at the young couple at the far end of the car. They had stopped whispering and were now staring at the man, their expressions a mixture of confusion and unease. The older man with the cane muttered something under his breath. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was enough to send a chill down my spine. Finally, the doors closed, and the train moved on. The man didn't return to his seat. Instead, he remained standing by the doors, his back to the rest of us. The tension in the car was palpable. Nobody spoke, but I could feel the unease spreading like a contagion. The young couple clutched each other's hands tightly, their eyes darting between the man and the doors. The older man tapped his cane against the floor, a nervous rhythm that grated on my nerves. I tried to focus on my phone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The man's presence was oppressive, like a dark cloud hanging over the car. At the next station, the train stopped again. This time, the doors opened, and the man stepped off. I expected relief to wash over me, but instead, the unease grew. The platform was empty, yet the man stood there motionless as the train began to pull away. His head turned slightly, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of his face. It was blank, not expressionless, blank. Smooth skin where there should have been eyes, a nose, a mouth. I blinked, my heart pounding in my chest. When I looked again, he was gone, swallowed by the darkness of the tunnel as the train sped away. The older man with the cane stood abruptly, gripping one of the poles for support. He muttered something about getting off at the next station, his voice shaking. The young couple exchanged worried glances but said nothing. I wanted to convince myself I had imagined it, that the dim lighting and my own exhaustion were playing tricks on me. But the atmosphere in the car told me otherwise. Everyone had seen it. At the next station, the older man exited without a word. The young couple followed, practically running toward the escalators. I stayed on the train, unable to move, my mind racing with questions. Who was that man? What had I seen? When the train reached my stop, I stumbled out onto the platform, still shaken. The station was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the train as it disappeared into the tunnel. I reported the incident to the station's security office, but they dismissed it as a hallucination or a prank. The cameras on the train hadn't captured anything unusual, just an empty car with a handful of passengers. But I know what I saw.